So I would like to have Randy come up still, and also Phil. Yeah, he's in back. So Zenon actually from Resolution Magazine will kind of try to kick it off a little bit, the Q&A. Maybe one word still to Tim's presentation where he talked about, loudness jumps despite the fact that two programs are on the same average loudness. That is clear that if we encourage dynamic range and higher loudness ranges, we will get loudness jumps still, of course, just like with this program. Ends very quietly, next commercial comes in, same average loudness, but a loudness jump. So either you accept that, that's a fact of life if you encourage more dynamic range and more loudness range, or, and that is also happening to some extent already in a few countries in Europe, most notably in Poland, where a commercial has to take into account the last 60 seconds of the program before and has to kind of be scaled according to what comes before and what comes after to avoid those jumps, which I find a little bit difficult in practical terms. So you probably would have to scale the commercial independently for, dependent on where it's inserted, what comes before and what comes after. So how this is handled in practical terms, I don't know. But there are regulations out there who try to take this into account. But if you don't do that, and it might be tricky also for artistic reasons, okay, how do you really enforce that? Then, of course, you have to accept that we will get loudness jumps still. If we have dynamics, we will get loudness jumps. But I think the situation will in any case be much better that the average will be the same. And so the loudness jumps are in a way also more understandable. If something ends really quiet, you kind of accept that something comes in louder than a really quiet ending of a movie. So I think the situation will in any case improve, but we will still have loudness jumps, absolutely. That was my comment to that.
Something covered in A85, and this may be covered in the EBU documents as well. There's a section on mixing and how important mix levels are. If you want somebody to mix with more bass, turn the low frequency response in the room down. They'll naturally do that. If you want somebody to mix with a more restricted dynamic range, it's incredibly simple. Use near-field speakers and turn the overall level down. They just naturally will do that. And that's in fact how many films have been transferred from a theatrical dynamic range to something more appropriate for DVD. Men in Black is a good example. Was mixed in a horn-loaded mix stage. When the DVD masters were to be created, it ended up using a pair of near-field speakers adjusted somewhere between 6 and 8 dB quieter on average, and the results fit. Certainly the dynamic range of the theatrical mix could have made it onto DVD, but this film studio felt that it was necessary to make something that's more appropriate for the home. So it does work, and it can be done artistically.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if that happens, you can remind somebody, if you do this on your programs constantly, and we keep, broadcasters keep getting complaints, something may happen to your program that you don't like. We can fix this together, but if you force either side to do it alone, the results aren't going to be as good.
Just a comment to that transition from the quiet moment to the loud moment. Watching television all my life, there used to be something called fade to black and silence. And there's a phenomenon that occurs. It's been done with listening tests. You take something quiet and something loud, and in time put them right up against each other, and then ask people about the effect of the loudness, and then move them apart and ask them how loud it sounds. By just moving the time apart, that second loud part doesn't sound as loud. So this is part of our perception. So when I was talking with one of our people that work a lot with ATSC, Jay Adrick, and I'm saying, why can't they just put a moment of black in? I'm going to know that something is going to happen, but no, it's right butt edited right into the commercial now. They've removed the black, and that's so DVRs can't not record the ads. So there's this phenomenon that happens as well, which makes the problem worse, right? It's the way that television's presented to the audience too. So even though it's all measured correctly and everything else and everything's good, you're going to still have that moment of change, but edited together, and it could cause, a complaint.
In former times, we used to play all the credits of a feature film with, music, which actually is quite around target level in many movies. The end credits music is quite on target with many movies. That would solve that, of course. But now today, with Avatar has 10 minutes end credits, whatever, it's of course impossible to do anymore. So it's understandable that those end credits are not played. And in former times, the end credits were, 20 seconds, but not anymore. But this is a fact of life. There's no black, there's no silence, there's no end credits whatsoever, and it won't come back. So, okay, Zenon, please.
One question, which I think is probably pertinent. Who's going to police this on an international level? I mean, who will have responsibility? We talk about the European Union, we talk about the American question, we talk about all the... Who's going to have powers to implement some form of punishment?
Everybody, and that's the problem. There may be an EU that's consistent across several countries, but Italy has a different standard
Absolutely,
than...
exactly,
so, yes.
So what happens? So why should anyone bother? You get away with it until you
put a processor in, please.
Yeah, well, that's what they end up doing.
No, why should they bother? I don't know. I mean, it's that's why it's up to us and the people that are concerned in this room about quality to do something about it, because solving it wrong is easy. Making the consumers not complain is really pretty simple. But are the program producers going to be willing to continue to produce the caliber of material over services that may not be paid for? We don't really have loudness problems on the HBOs and the movie channels. They are taking the time, they are devoting resources to managing there's no adverts, but they do have these interstitial plugs and things. They are managing that. So, I think it's possible. I think for the betterment of the art, we have this sounds preachy, a moral responsibility to get this right, but no real legal one. If you want to satisfy legal, again, it's easy.
Well, I have some good news for you, Zen. I've started some serious combat training, so I will enforce that. Actually, what we originally planned in the EBU after our standard was a kind of roadshow in Europe, at least, to really make people aware everywhere, the broadcasters, etc. And although we couldn't do that in the first place as we had planned in the onset, it's now happening. So I'm really traveling around all over Europe, and broadcasters are very open and very willing to follow in Europe, and also the commercial ones, because you do not need to explain the benefits of loudness normalization to commercial broadcasters. They know, and they do it since 10 years already, some of them. For instance, Danish Broadcasting, TV2, a commercial one, they even constructed their own loudness meter 10 years ago to be able to kind of judge the loudness of commercials. And they were just, hallelujah, happy, now the standard is here, fantastic. So they know the benefit of loudness normalization to the consumers and to the listeners. And even it goes as far as in Italy, Fox has started loudness normalization 3 or 4 years ago at a level that is almost 10 dB or LU lower than RAI as a commercial broadcaster. But they didn't care because they normalized all their channels, all their theme channels, and the result was more listener satisfaction, higher revenue through advertisement. So they actually made more money with the concept of loudness normalization because they had higher viewer and listener satisfaction.
That's a great point.
And that's something that we were very encouraged by, that a commercial broadcaster doesn't care that they are lower in level now. They just care about higher listener satisfaction. And that's what many broadcasters see. And this is the complaint number one. It's not too difficult to convince management we should do this. And I think in TV, as a midterm idea, we have really passed the point of no return in Europe. So it's really happening TV. I think we can safely say we have done this now. It'll take a couple of years until it's really widespread everywhere, but the next year is going to...
Is the cost of implementation not an issue?
Certainly
in
not,
these
no,
times?
certainly not, because compare that to the cost of HD in video, to the switch from SD to HD. Their loudness is peanuts compared to that. And I would argue that the effect of switching to full loudness normalization has more impact on the listener and the viewer than maybe the effect of HD. I mean, that's, of course, apples and oranges to compare. But the initial cost of employing and buying a few loudness meters for your key personnel in key areas and some training, of course, is not really, a catastrophe for a broadcaster. That's not really an issue, I have to say. Yes? Just a second, wait for the microphone, maybe? Here, in the middle of here. So that
there's been several comments to over-processing. And I just want to add a little comment to that, just for a moment. What happens is if you do remove all nuance and you do remove all dynamic range, of course you fall well into the compliance side of things. And you made a comment that it helped revenue. There's another phenomenon that can take place called listener fatigue, where if there isn't a lot of change, people will tend to switch away. So it's a balancing act, definitely, that we're looking at here as you should consider to process the signal. There really is a balance. You can move right into compliance, but then you may cause other issues.
That was a slight misunderstanding, that the Italian channel didn't process it. They really just scaled the programs. They just did scaling.
Okay.
Because they process very dynamic commercials, feature films, etc. So only with scaling, only
with scaling.
The right way,
Yeah,
not
it's-
processing.
Yeah, it's the
Not processing.
it's the other than feeling hungry, but the sausage factor that you had.
Yeah.
pointed out.
That's they didn't do that. No, they didn't do that.
So that was
They
with
didn't do that.
scaling.
Yeah. Just with scaling.
Thank you.
Please, gentlemen here.
So yes, I was thinking this has been mentioned, we've mentioned play-out and we've mentioned post-production, but there's the whole broadcast industry, including scheduling and everything else, which should be considered as well. You mentioned the out of a death scene into the shampoo advert. That could be tailored to an extent within the scheduling area as well, such as inserting for certain clips like that, fade to black and back out again, or tailoring what advert comes after that, rather than just willy-nilly filling the commercial break with whoever pays most, I suppose. Or
Well, yes, I think it's a good idea, but I think you also pay for where in the kind of...
still have a certain amount of juggling within that slot as to where you can fit things and how you schedule one to come after the other, or putting a couple of seconds of, or
Absolutely,
a second of...
Good idea that you insert a commercial that also starts lower in level, for instance, yeah? You mean that?
Yes,
Yeah,
you can.
okay.
Because currently in play-out, which is my area at the moment, we have a commercial need to add compliance to certain of our customers for R128. And that is tending to make things float up and down exactly as you described, but we can't stop doing it because there will be commercial backlash on that from our customers. The metadata, as you said, the metadata devil would be extremely useful for us. As you rightly said, it's not going to work as a scheduled item properly because you have to have someone to watch it and you have to have the flags put in, and that won't happen. But if there is some method of fitting metadata within at the post-production stage, which could be picked up and play out, that would solve a lot of the problems we have.
But it has to be effortless.
Well, exactly, it has to be effortless because you
here's-
won't get
here's
people
your
to put the
control
effort in all
panel.
the time.
Yeah, I know you're mixing, but here's your control panel. You got 240 metadata parameters to set. You can imagine how the sales job went.
Just a flag to say it's been looked at in
Yep,
would be useful.
sure would be. And also for checking compliance later on.
Absolutely, that's an important point.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
You had no major complaints about the feature films, which I find
That's right, yeah.
completely contrary to my experience of TV. So what do you reckon that's about then?
Well, I think I'm right in saying that we don't actually process many of our output on films. I don't know if John or Ian could clarify that. But also, I can't really explain it. All I'm doing is stating the fact that I could not find a complaint that was pertained to a particular film. The only thing I could find was our own homegrown production. had complaints about it. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, maybe the amount of effort that goes into the production of a film pays off at the end.
Just on that last point, maybe it's also because with a feature film you tend to sit down to watch it, and maybe the background noise and the distraction is considerably less than it would be on programming, which is less compulsive.
Could be, yeah. And just on that, going back to my sort of research about the complaints, talking about the changing of volume between content. The difficulty we have in the BBC is so much stuff comes from different areas in the BBC. So when Florian says, "Oh, you just put a couple of meters in there," it's quite a big process for the BBC. That means all our regions, all our nations
simplifying, of
have
course,
to do it. And I was looking at adopting R128. The sort of process we were looking at was to normalise at the output. But even then, how do we normalise opt-outs? Regional opt-outs, Scottish or Northwest TV or something like that. It's quite difficult to do that, really. To do it effectively, you have to do it further back in the chain, in the production chain. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Get it right at the beginning of the entire workflow with the right metadata. And if you've got that, you've solved a lot of the issues that can happen downstream.
I think the discussion's been a lot about sort of the program material that's been, produced already. You've got to remember we do a lot of live content per day. Probably 2 or 3 hours easily on BBC One. So, and that's the key for us. That's where we get the complaints, in the continuity and the opt-outs.
Well, let me tell you about I'm sorry to step on you, Ray.
Sure.
I was present at the Beijing Olympics and then the Vancouver Olympics for NBC. And during both of these events, the mixers had loudness meters added to their normal metering. So, as we talk to people in rooms like this, one of the comments we hear is, I have metering. I don't want to give up my metering. And so we had to get people past the idea, well, am I just supposed to look at this number the whole time? Well, no. Do you drive a car that way? No, you glance down every now and then and make sure you're not going to get a ticket. And then you use your meters, whatever they are, ppm, VU, whatever they might be. And we found actually in Beijing that the mixers were generally mixing too quietly. And it was because it was a VU scale on a bar graph. So normally where VU is 0 and it goes up to +3 or something, 0 was aligned with -20 dB full scale, and they had 20 dB above that, and the color of the meter changed to red as soon as you got above 0. So everybody was too low by 3 or 4 dB, and so this made inserted adverts back in New York even worse. So they solved that. We solved it by goosing the engineers and saying louder, 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 turning their monitors in the tech area from reading peak to actually reading VU, because in peak everything looked wrong. And so, no, it's too loud, it's too loud. Metering ended up being 90% of the problem. So by a few days into it, where at first they had to put somebody in a studio in New York and have the advert pods come up on a console right next to the feed from Beijing, and there was somebody manually managing it, which worked perfectly, by the way. Not a single complaint.
That's an interesting comment, that, and I accept it. But what you mentioned there was you had to force the actual engineers in Beijing to beef it up. In the BBC's context, that would mean forcing the people from national news, from local news.
No, I didn't say it right. The meters in the consoles were set wrong. They were looking at them differently, and this was before they had a loudness meter. And we said, your target is -24, but you're at -29. And as soon as they began seeing that, they said, yeah, but my meters down here now say that I'm seeing red. Not that it's wrong, but I'm seeing red. So yeah, it took a little bit of education, but there's a limit to how much we can do without telling people that it's a little different now. Not totally, don't throw away the meters. I think PPM will actually the meters will react much better to this than a VU meter, which instantly goes into red above 0. That was the problem there. But having a loudness meter that gives a number it's remarkably simple. And by the way, Vancouver, it took no training at all. People were able to sit down and mix. It wasn't being run through a studio, things matched.
Can I ask then, how did you deal with the news content?
That was being mixed back in New York, and they have loudness meters on the stage there.
Okay, right.
The mixer has a loudness meter on the back of his console.
Maybe
Yeah,
we
it's
have
a lot of loudness
still
meters.
one from the audience. I think there was a comment here.
I'd like to just join that debate a little bit in terms of the rollout. I was project manager for Channel 4 when we built the new centre in Horseferry Road in the middle 90s. We tackled the issue at that stage, and I just take your point in terms of you're saying that commercial operators may be less inclined to take loudness on, but we took it on because specifically the issue was it all comes down to the interstitials, the bits in between the programs being very different to the programs. That's what really causes the pain. So at that stage, there weren't obviously the EBU loudness curves, etc., but Chromatech made a loudness meter, and some of you may know the product. I installed those in all of the QA rooms, so the program material that came in was actually gauged in terms of a scale that we actually normalized. Then the same process was applied to the commercials, and the idea was, and the promos and trails that we did, because that's one of the bigger culprits. You would talk about the ads, but actually one of the worst things is the trails that we create ourselves. So by normalizing those, we ended up with at least a normal experience throughout the junction. When I moved to S4C some 12 years ago, same issues were coming up. And we have a supply chain there, obviously a commissioning centre. So a bit like the BBC, lots of programs coming from all different places, not all under our control by any means. But again, the whole perspective here was to ensure we had loudness meters in the transmission areas, the edit suites, the QA areas, and in the supply chain. So part of my requirements was that they would actually comply to our loudness requirements. So when they made a program and mixed it, live events included, they have a loudness meter on site. By actually guiding that in conjunction with the PPM, you end up with a fairly consistent flow through your chain. And I think it's a common sense approach. Now, there's no metadata in all of that, and there's relatively little training required because most people do understand meters, and they know that if you're within these scales, you're okay. So they're using an intelligent approach where that meter is actually displayed on screen alongside. It's a bar graph, it displays the PPMs and it displays the loudness, and they ride both of them. And I think that's so it's interesting to see where it's going now, but the practicalities of this has been addressed by a lot of broadcasters. Now we're talking from the middle 90s onwards.
Actually, the first broadcaster who's really done it systematically was the German Democratic Republic, starting the whole thing at 1956. 56. So they did, papers and, scientific studies and implemented the system of loudness normalization decades before we now talk about it. But at that time, they always tried to kind of, raise the importance of the subject, but we thought, no, it's not an issue, let the guys speak in a way. But they started very early on. I just wanted to say something to your comment. Yes, of course, it's not that difficult to be done, but the general idea, at least that we have in EBU R128, is very clearly that we want to cure the disease and not the symptoms. Yeah, that's exactly, we want to get the source right, because that really trickles down then and makes the rest of the chain much easier. And it is also, I think, the primary kind of approach to encourage higher audio quality. If everything has to be produced to the same average loudness, you really are almost forced to venture into this new world of more dynamics, because more dynamic mixes will survive better or will win. Highly compressed sources and stuff will lose. So with the idea of getting the source right, curing the disease and not the symptoms, I think we are on the good route to simplify our life, because keep it simple, I think, is mandatory in this world of, just look at the AV receiver manual these days. I mean, it's just unbelievable what you can adjust and what can go wrong. So I think keeping it simple is mandatory.
I accept that. One of the issues I think we need to address is News, live news content. Now, what's more important, breaking news or the correct volume?
Well, you can also produce breaking news with the correct volume. That is not mutually exclusive.
Which is more important?
Which is more important, of course, to get the news on air, of course. So
Yeah.
for that, you might have, for sources you have no control over, where you don't exactly know what it is, you might have this processor as a safety net, you know. So there are ways to solve that, and the important thing is to start with a general strategy and idea, and then step by step, you know, implement that. But the most important thing is to switch your mind to loudness normalization and get the source right. I think that is,
So
that is
that's
the general
quite
first step.
That's quite a change of step for our people that produce.
It is a
news,
step,
you know.
but it is for the people who have ears and have used their ears, it's back to what they used to do. And I think that's also important for inexperienced operators. You know, just a second, yeah. Like video editors. You know, we have basically, you know, discouraged them from using their ears with having wrong meters for them. Yeah. So now when they have a loudness meter, they now see what they should hear. And I think that kind of encourages them back to rely more and more again on their hearing, because they have ears too, and they are listeners too, and they exactly know when something is too loud or too soft. But they have to kind of unlearn to forget the meter they used now and have a meter now that actually reflects what they're hearing. And I think that will improve what we get from the edit room too. So I think that's also an interesting aspect. There was a guy in the back.
1 second before he starts, though. But Philip, part of this is getting Ofcom off this idea that one viewer complaint is a loudness problem. It's breaking news. Doesn't Ofcom understand this? I mean, I'm picking on them, but I've just heard story after story of, you know, somebody has to understand, yes, it was annoyingly loud, but for goodness sake, you know, who knows what happened? There was a huge explosion, and we're covering it. So tempering some of that, getting some education back up to the regulatory level also is really, really important, and I think we'll talk about that soon.
There's
Sorry.
a comment here in the back, yeah.
Yeah, Tony Orme from TSL. My question is this. Isn't this an impossible task? Because the traditional days of television, we had the PPM, by definition, it's peak program, so we could quite easily see when the peaks in the program were. Now we're looking at integrating over a period of time. So for live transmissions, in hindsight, we have to know what was transmitted so we can change the broadcast and the mix within the broadcast. I think maybe this is one of the reasons films don't attract the complaints that may happen with live broadcasts, because remastering films, the editors and the engineers have the option of going through the same sequence many, many times to re-edit that particular sequence. But in live transmissions, that's impossible by definition. So within loudness monitoring, are we not trying to achieve the impossible?
That's quite a good point. I can pick one program in particular, Country File, which we got quite a few complaints. And I think the reason we do get complaints is because the turnaround of that program is basically edited on a Thursday and Friday. We don't even get a chance to put it in a file-based format. It's actually delivered by tape on a Sunday and played out on a Sunday. So you're very right. You know, with the films, they've had months to actually work on the post-production. But some programs, we have very little time to do that post-production. It's really just get it in the can and get it sent down to Red B to play out on a Sunday afternoon.
I have good news here. It is possible. Yeah. It is definitely possible. And it's much less difficult than you think. I'm a mixer myself, and so the experienced guys, they pretty quickly learn how to deal with that in a live program. So, I just don't want to talk now endlessly about how you do it live, but you have anchor signals too in live. You have the commentary, you basically kind of have an idea what you are mixing. You're mixing a football match or whatever, so you have an idea about what might happen. And then you start maybe with a little bit of slack, a little bit lower in level so that you have room to move. You basically mix your average, your anchor signals around target level, and then you trust your ears. And then it's not too difficult to stay within the tolerance, for instance, in EBU is plus minus 1 LU. And it has been proven now many times already that is quite easily possible. And one way to do it is also, I just measure what I've mixed last week. And I measure all my programs the last 2 months, how loud am I mixing? And if I'm mixing 3 LU too loud on average, and you usually do not change your average mixing level from day to day and week to week or month to month, if you mix 3 LU too loud, I just crank up the monitor, the replay volume 3 dB, and force myself to mix lower end level. And then you're there. So it is absolutely possible live. And if there's something totally unexpected happening, big explosion or whatever, okay, there will be occasions where we are not within the tolerance or whatever. But that's fine, that's what live is about. But it is possible also to stay within the tolerance in live programming, absolutely.
You know, I forgot to mention those two Olympics, hundreds of hours of programming, no processing. The
And
processing
all
was
live,
processed.
all live, and all basically on target, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
it's possible, absolutely.
Yep.
It's absolutely possible.
Florian,
First day was
Yes,
tough.
yeah,
but-
sorry.
Yeah, I thought you would say that, you would speak up, Martin.
You just said most of what I was going to say, actually,
Yeah,
Florian.
yeah.
Mark Flack from BSkyB. One of the things that I found very interesting, we've been using loudness meters literally alongside or underneath our PPMs. And the majority of our staff haven't been forced to use them yet. They're there for familiarisation, if you like, to let them to discover. And what I've found quite consistently is that although they're not looking at the loudness meter at all, you wander into a control room whilst they're live on air, look at the history, and they're mixing to 23 anyway. A pair of ears and a PPM. So yeah, it's totally possible for it to work live. It'll even work without the loudness meter. if you've got
Absolutely,
skilled operators,
absolutely,
so-
absolutely.
That's a good point.
Who was next one? Over here? Pat, you? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for introducing me. I'm Pat Waddell from Harmonic, and I'm the Stuckey as chair of TSGS 6, which is the body responsible for producing A85. And one thing that I would like everybody in the room to understand is you don't want the legislators looking over your shoulder the way that we now have in the United States and in Canada. Having a recommended practice that was written as a recommended practice suddenly turned into a standard essentially by federal legislation really cramps the ability of the ATSC to tweak the document over time in a way that I think, thankfully, PLOUD is going to be able to work on its documents. So the industry, I think, has a few years of a window here to fix things by the industry. And if you don't, then the legislators will fix it for you, and that translates into sausage. And we really don't want to go there. So let's pay attention and have more sessions like this and fix it.
Can I ask, what was the real motivation for the CARM Act? What was the driver behind it?
The driver behind it apparently was that Representative Eshoo, and the irony of all of this is I live less than a mile away from her district, visited her parents, and they're old and have hearing difficulties, and like has been alluded to, I think they were listening to the end of something coming into a commercial and had turned it up. And suddenly the commercial comes on, and she was there and was highly annoyed by it. And the original way the legislation was written, it was modulation in the old FM modulation language, right? And people looked at it because ATSC had been working on A85 for 2 years before this started. And we were well underway, and we read the legislation as proposed with horror. And it would have been just a train wreck, because how would the FCC have turned something that talked about modulation levels, right, into rules for digital? So fortunately, the language got changed to at least be digital and mention A85, but we really don't want to be there,
So,
and we're stuck.
if I understand you right, it was down to one particular politician.
Yes.
Interesting.
And like many ideas like this, it's motherhood and apple pie. How can you
Yeah, right.
possibly vote against
That's right.
Exactly.
solving commercial loudness problems? Hello, right? So, which is why I think in Europe there's a similar danger. And we have an opportunity now with PLOUD and the documents that are produced for the industry to get everything under control without it being legislated, and that it gets done right.
And can I also ask, who actually gets penalised if they break the Act?
The broadcaster that actually emits the signal is the one that's the Stuckey. And they're supposed to take care that everything upstream is okay. So we'll see how this plays out.
Well, at least I can have just one quick comment that the situation is looking good in Europe, and then in the back. It's
Pat,
looking good in
before you-
Europe now, yeah.
Could you explain, Florian had touched on this before, but we've got a situation where two different versions of BS 1770 are referred to, and there's a political reason why this happened, but I think it's interesting to talk about this and understand that the technologist behind it didn't intend for this.
Yeah, this is the law of unintended consequences. And this is one of the areas where being written into federal law really constrained what we felt we could do. We had no experience with 1770 version 2 because it published in the spring of this year. And we did not have a chance to do any of the testing that we'd done with the initial version. And so we did not feel comfortable saying we're going to force people to use something that we don't feel comfortable about. So the decision was taken, and it was an intentional decision, that the US, we will stay with version 1. What that translates into for you manufacturers of measuring equipment is you're going to need to have a switch on it that says, you know, A85 mode and R128 mode, and hopefully we can live with that. It's software, but that's an important distinction, and thanks for reminding me about that, Tim.
Just there's one question, I think, more.
In the back with CF here, please.
Kasper Olsen, TV2 Denmark. We've been adjusting commercials for 10 years and measuring them. And it's one guy who's sitting in front of a television doing all of those. So when we started doing 128 last year, we did a lot of measuring on him just to see what happens. And that's one thing that we've noticed is the higher commercial is compressed, the lower it will sound when it's adjusted for the R128. It's just a tiny bit, but if you want to be a little louder, you have to mix better.
Absolutely.
So you will be
Absolutely.
punished to over-process things.
That's exactly what we want. Yeah?
Yeah.
If you mix more
That's
dynamically, you win.
And that's one of the part we found out. And the other, we did 24 measurements of of TV2 and broke it up in parts and found out what's the major problem. And as the other guy over there said, it's the trailer. It's like everything produced is consistent. If you got a news program, it's consistent at one level. You got a trailer at one level who's consistent, and so on. So all the stuff that is file-based, we don't see any problem in it if we adjust that. And the live programs, well, it's typical 240B over 0 LU. So it's not that big a problem. It's mostly just file-based adjustments. So we try to keep it doing one part at a time. We've done the commercials, they've been adjusted since June, and now we'll adjust the trailer, internal trailer part from 1st February, and then we'll look at the next parts. So the only thing we haven't found a solution on is the film, but no one will.
Well, thank you for also your comment. This is from TV2 from Denmark. They do that since 10 years with the commercials. That's what I mentioned before. I'm afraid I have to be the party crasher here, because I was asked that we should stop now the Q&A and we can continue outside, I think, because it's now lunchtime.